Well, good evening and greetings. I'm Bob Graves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. Now, tonight I'm hoping to continue the series that I began last Sunday in talking about um, some of the ways in which my thinking has become unconventional, and comparing it specifically with some of the more conventional views, helping to give that some sort of context or contrast. And of course, I want to reiterate that in the process of my becoming, as they called me, unconventional, was not really a process that was deliberately trying to be, different or weird or somehow a stick in the eye, but rather it had more to do with the fact that I was working with. Excuse me, I'm grab a glass of water here. It's refreshing. Could have been wine, but it was water. Anyhow, thank you. That was my wife, Lisa. She makes sure that I'm sitting here comfortable during the show. The process of looking for honesty sometimes it just required me to go down a different road than the one that I had been on. And I suppose that all of us enter into life, thrown at it and finding ourselves in a context and trying to figure out, well, what are the rules of the context here? What are we supposed to do and not supposed to do? And we sort of, to a certain degree, conform. And then, eventually, though, we reach a point where we begin to ask some serious questions and realize that things aren't working. And I certainly got to that point in my own ministry where I began to be aware of just too many things that really didn't add up and didn't make sense. And there was a time there when I had to decide, what do I do with this? And I found that there was nothing that I could do with it except lean into it, embrace it, and let it take me where it would. And so today we'll continue on talking about some of these things that would be some of the paths of the road that I found I've had to just kind of find a different lane to travel on, as it were. Now, we were talking last week when we got rudely interrupted by time, talking about some of the way that the dominant thinking that exists within traditional Protestantism or fundamentalism and Catholicism and things like that, some of the more mainstream points of view that we deal with here. But obviously, one thing that remains in common with me and some of these mainstream perspectives is that we both are beginning at a point where we have put faith in the assumption that God exists. And not, of course, not everyone does that, and not just people that would consider themselves atheists per se. For example, a lot of people may not realize this, but Buddhism is for many a very atheistic spirituality. To many Buddhists, it's a way of life of leaning into the ways of disconnecting oneself from the sources of anxiety and stress and finding peace through an approach of life that doesn't really, although it might include emulating the Buddha. And it might be something where they understand the structure of the metaphysical reality of spirituality, but they don't necessarily believe in a divine being. That's not necessarily even a part of it. And there's even some places in the world where people have no problem seeing Buddhism as a philosophical approach to things, but they use that philosophical approach in being Christians. So it's just one of those approaches that's a little different. But if there's no God, then much of what we as Christians might talk about doesn't even really make sense. So obviously, since I'm considering myself still as a person who's a person of faith, I in my unconventionality have not dismissed that. I certainly have come to the point, however, where I have recognized that the question of God's existence is an absolutely legitimate question. Not only that, but I've gotten to the point where I've decided it is such a legitimate question that it does not have an answer. Now, that's a kind of a scary view to take, I suppose, for some people who believe. The idea that I believe in a God that I can't prove, and where I accept the fact that I can't prove this. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm just kind of wandering around in the dark and having no sense of anything that has anything to do with God at all. That's not true. I live every day of my life having this sense that I am loved, that I am in His presence. It is for me a very real experience. It is for me something that has changed my life, something that has been a huge part of who I am and how I have evolved as a person. What I'm saying, though, is not that I don't have the Christian experience in this sense, but that I realize that there are so many different ways a person could explain it or explain it away, that I can accept the fact that I can't prove this, and I don't feel any need to. I don't care. It doesn't bother me that it is unprovable. I'm comfortable with the fact. In fact, the fact that I can't prove it is part of the reason why I don't even want to try. And if somebody that I were to meet on the street doesn't believe in God, that's fine by me. I don't have an issue with that, because I have nothing inside my pocket that I can take out and give to them and say, you must believe. I would certainly encourage people to give it some thought, give it, and certainly the faith that I have come to is a very, very real faith, but it is not one that is based upon, oh, okay, well, I've had some experiences and I know some things, and so I know that there is a God. I believe there is. I believe that I can attribute a great deal of what is going on as I make sense of it to the God that I believe in. But I realize that that is merely something that is a coherent part of the whole story. And so therefore, I think I do have an obligation to be honest, to be coherent, to be reasonably consistent when consistency is important. It's not always, but so that's a little bit too weak. It's kind of like saying, well, tell me something that'll change my mind. I can't. Why don't you tell yourself something that will change your mind? Or why don't you experiment yourself? That's more where it is that I would be coming from. Now, part of this also led me to the point where I looked at a lot of, as I mentioned last week, the systematic theologies that I was looking at, and some of them were very, very in depth. Some were very, very spurious and shallow, but I had collected a great number of systematic theologies and had studied them. And I was really trying to find a systematic theology that I could latch onto. And I finally came to the point where I realized, I don't know that we can have a clear systematic concept of God. I don't know that we need one. Why would we need such a concept if it's not because we're trying to find some way of socially posturing ourselves as people of faith? I wanted to give all of that up. I don't need to have a posture. It's fine for me to believe. It's fine if somebody else doesn't believe. I find that many people that I have spoken to have actually become believers because of that lower key approach to the possibility. But at the same time, I don't think we need this. I don't know where this need comes from anymore. I used to think I did, but I don't know where this need comes from anymore for where we need to be able to understand exactly what's going on with God, who He is, what He's like, and all of these other things that we're somehow now going to know. Now, I will tell you that in my relationship with God, it means far more to me that He loves me. It means far more to me that He is present with me than that, well, He is God. Now, I suppose that's wonderful for Him, but I don't know that I even understand these ideas or these concepts or even know how to differentiate what may or may not be true about them, in spite of the fact that I might believe that He is the one who has created all that I see before me, all that is. I don't know that I'm really a person qualified to know all of the details of what's going on inside of the realities of God. But I do know this, that to sense myself embraced, to sense myself welcomed in, to sense myself loved. This is something now that I can use, that I can make, that I can relate to. And so in my relationship with God, I'm not so much worried about getting all of the systematic questions routed out anymore, but more maintaining the relationship. In some sense, this is similar to the way that my marriage actually works, and that my wife and I've been together since 1988. We've gone through a lot of things together. We're getting to know each other in some ways, and I'm not an expert on understanding everything about her, and I don't feel the need to be this expert in all of this. But I tell you this, I do invest myself in the relationship, and I enjoy the way the relationship works and the way that it is. And that's where the joy of our life together comes from, in the experience we have together as an experience of two human beings. Now, some of these things that were part of this concept came up to be questioned for me, this concept of the systematic theology. Things such as, and I think I mentioned this even last week a little bit, is God infinite? I don't think that a lot of people realize that we don't really know what that would even mean. What are the implications of infinity? Now, I'm not saying God is not. I'm not saying he is. I'm saying I don't think we can really appreciate the implications of just such an idea. And of course, to whatever it is you're going to understand about the biblical text, it is important to know that the concept of infinity that we use today, the way we talk about it, there is no word in the Bible, in Old or New Testament, that speaks of infinity in this way. There are none. So I'm not even sure it's even a part of standard. It's certainly a part of our theology, but I certainly don't think it's part of our literary past and the text that we use to justify any authority in our faith of any sort. But what does it mean? In fact, here's a good question. What does it mean that we even pursue this question? Why do we even ask? Why is it we feel the need to talk about the infinity of God? Why can't, how big he is or not, or whether this is everything or not, or a lot, or why do we worry about this question? What does that say about us? I like to say a few things about that later, but I think that some of the things it says about us is not necessarily all that flattering. It may have more to do with our insecurities. It may have more to do with the need we might have to have a faith where we can show other people through our faith and with our faith that we're not stupid, dumb people who just believe in superstitions. So in order to not be taken as a dumb, stupid person who believes in superstitions, I've got to have this whole concept of God that includes, the fact that like Anselm said, any God as large as you could imagine him, that is God. And if there was anything that could be imagined greater than that, that would have to be God. This need to bring in all of the hyperbole and all of the extremes strikes me as being more of a problem than a real intellectual understanding of God. Why do we feel he needs to be? I'm not so sure that that works for us all that well. I'm looking at my notes. Why can't our knowledge of God be partial, incomplete, uncertain? Why can't it be personal? Why can't it be relational? Why can't it be contained within an experience that we can't even articulate? Why can't it be mysterious? What's wrong with this? Why can't we even be people who are honestly mistaken about the way we understand some of these things? Is there anything really wrong with that? Is there anything that we have to lose by not being so deeply invested in the accuracy of the way we believe we understand our experience, even our spiritual experience? Can't we remain open? Can't we remain childlike? Can't we remain open to the mystery and left in the conundrum of the balances of life and having trust in the ride, not even really knowing where it is all headed or how it's getting there? So, when it comes to God, though, we talk about this being who created the universe, but sometimes I think we we talk about him in a way where we actually turn him into something that is, we don't mean to, but we turn him into something that's almost materialistic, without thinking of it. That, as if the universe was just something he kind of rearranged and moved into place, instead of the fact that maybe the reality of God is something that that is something that deals with something other than all of the observable universe. Maybe everything that can fit into that equation, E equals MC squared, has nothing to do with the very real essence of God. Now, I have no problem, I've talked about this before, believing in a multidimensional universe, which would mean that I would perceive God as being a being who, unlike us, who we can understand a place, we can understand a line, we can understand a line that comes off that at a right angle and another line that comes off at a right angle. So we have width, we've got height, we've got depth. Okay, where do you go from there if you want another right angle? We can't do that. But in math, you can. And in a potentially multi-dimensional universe, that would be something that if there were a God, he would have no problem understanding, working with it. And if God is a multidimensional God, and if he created the universe, he'd have to be, I have no problem believing in that kind of a God. And that would be one where, when we start talking about who he is and what he's like and all that, there would have to be many things that would simply be beyond our comprehension or our ability to even think about, articulate, imagine, or articulate. Now, so as a result, it's not surprising that there's many different ways that people would talk about God. And so it's not surprising that we do have so many different ways that people think and believe, whether it's atheism, where there is no God, or pantheism, where God is the universe, or that God is in the universe, or polytheism, maybe there's a lot of gods, or some people might even be what you might call finite theists, where they believe in God, but he's just this big guy, not everything, not infinite, whatever. Or the traditional Christian concept of an infinite God. But I find that when we're doing all of that this is part of where I find I had to take that different route. These are all interesting things, but they're all trying to figure out God. And I find the question interesting to pursue, but I find it useless and fruitless. And so I want my faith to therefore pursue, really personally, other questions than those. Now, this brings me to the last thing that I want to say about these concepts of God, and then we'll look at some other things in the weeks to come. But I've looked at over the years, we've had various what we might call arguments for God, and as I mentioned before, these strike me as being expressions of insecurity. And so I want to talk about what some of them are, and maybe even discuss what that is. I might have a comment here. Viewer comment. Is it possible that God is so vast that he merely appears to be infinite to our small minds? Well, sure. Absolutely. In fact, we don't know that the universe is infinite itself. Well, that it isn't. But evidently, if it's going to be brought into existence, it is difficult for us to conceive of this in any manner if we're going to attribute it to God as his not being so vast that infinity just seems to make a lot of sense. But when we start talking about infinity, we don't realize the mathematical problems of it. Just like we don't know how to divide any quantity by zero. We don't know what that means. I think an illustration I've used sometimes when it comes to infinity is, it says the Skype sound from your machine is feeding back to me in the show, but it sounds like you fixed it. Maybe it did. I may need to change some of the mix here, but Joe, I'll take a look at that in a second if you hear it again. Back at this thing, I've used this illustration before. Let's pretend, just for the sake of a mathematical problem and an argument, that I've got two barrels here. One is a barrel filled with an infinite number of cats, and then the barrel over here is an infinite number of dogs. And let's say that God knows every name of every cat in this barrel and doesn't know the name of a single dog in this other barrel. Uh, if this were for the sake of argument, a scenario that could exist, that would mean that God's knowledge, when it just comes to cats alone, is infinite. But it would also mean that his ignorance, when it comes to these dogs, is also infinite. So that his knowledge could be both infinite and his ignorance can be infinite at the same time. This is part of the way infinity works. And this is starting to get into the area of absurd and undefined. We don't know what to make with it. And I think that what it means when we start giving something the quality of infinity, we're getting into implications that are way beyond any ability to really make sense of or deal with intelligently. And so, in a sense, this is one of the reasons why I find the question more worthy of being dismissed without answering it than necessarily being answered with a definitive, oh, he's infinite, or no, he's not infinite. But evidently, when you look at the even some of the encouragement that the Old Testament gave to us, when it spoke of the power of God, it spoke of the things that he had done. When Job is in the book of Job, were you there when I formed the foundations of the earth? Were you there when I told the sea you can come this far and no farther, and things like this? The power of God is displayed, in a sense, by seeing the things that he has done and evidently been sufficient for. Isn't that good enough? That his power, that his intelligence, that his skills, that his abilities, that whatever are more than sufficient for whatever it is going to be calling upon them. So, yeah. But getting back at that, is it possible that God is so vast that he merely appears to be infinite to our small minds? Sure. And but let's realize that the way it may appear to be doesn't necessarily mean that is what it is. Joey, I'm going to see if I can fix that. I think I see the problem. And let's hope that fixes it. So why don't you send me another message, just say hi or something and see if it comes through. You can't hear it anymore. Let's try that, okay? Anyhow, so stop reading my comments. I have to. I'm addicted to your comments, Joey, because, I was watching your show earlier and I thought that you and Matt did such an awesome impression of both Bob Graves and Greg Bray that for a minute there, I thought I was watching the other show, but it was just amazing. So I love you guys. Anyhow, some of the arguments that we have used to, sorry for the confusion. Yeah, good. Some of the arguments that we've used to try to prove God strike me as being actually a form of insecurity. I'm not interested in proving him. In fact, to be honest with you, the attempt to prove God, I think, weakens the concept, to be honest with you. But there's this thing called the cosmological argument, and that is the idea that, everything had to have a beginning. And so what causes that beginning? Well, God would have to be the cause of the beginning, because before the beginning, there wasn't anything. And so if there's something, the fact that we have this universe that exists, that has come about somehow. And then also some people would include in this cosmological argument the fact that it's all here now. What sustains it? What keeps it going? How does it maintain its existence? Why doesn't it just kind of evaporate and dissipate into nothingness again if it hasn't always been? And this would be perceived as being something we can attribute to God. Now, the Big Bang Theory doesn't include an explanation for what would have created the Big Bang. But there are some scientific theories, not that I agree or disagree with them, that might perceive the universe as being in some sort of a cyclical multidimensional dissipation that then repeats itself forever. And in some of those theories, don't you like the way that I'm very scientifically explained it? In some of those theories, though, the way that it goes is that we may have infinitely been here. We may have been here forever. So there may not ever been a beginning. That is the way that some people say. Now, I don't know what to think about that, but I certainly can't tell you that it didn't happen. And then you have the people like Stephen Hawking who suggested, and I find this somewhat ludicrous, but then again, Stephen Hawking tends to be a kind of a smart guy. And so I should perhaps find him ludicrous with a little bit of humility. But anyhow, one of the things that he had said was that the laws of physics itself would have required the Big Bang. And so the beginning required nothing. It didn't have to have a cause. Because there's such a law as gravity, the universe can create itself from nothing. There's something he had to say about that. I can't remember exactly how that works. But anyway, so spontaneous creation is something that has been argued by some theoretical physicists. Why do we exist? Why does the universe exist? This is sometimes seen as an argument for God. But at the same time, we had Mike Shaw on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he even suggested that the universe could possibly be eternally pulsating and doesn't even require a creation. I found that to be an interesting statement, and he wasn't even claiming that's the way it was. He was saying, "Oh, what do we know?" And so the point that it gets down, basically, this argument assumes that there are things that exist, but that in order for them to have existed, they had to have had a beginning, and that it's the idea that some things contingently exist. That is, if they didn't have a cause, they wouldn't exist in just this way. I don't think that we know that. I don't think that we know that. So I find the argument of the cosmological argument for God to be, well, I find it interesting, but I don't find it compelling. Now, obviously, if God did create the universe, then it would be true that he started it. I mean, that wouldn't that be just obvious? This may be true, and I personally believe that it would be true, but the argument can't be made in a way that would require anyone to believe it. At best, it can only be a reasonable possibility that can't be just pushed away. Well, there is a universe here. It got started, perhaps, and that's consistent with some idea. But in a sense, I don't find this to be anything compelling for the idea that I don't find it compelling that there had to be a start, and I don't find it compelling that if it started, it had to have been started by God. Now, this is not to deny the possibility of creation. It's not to deny God, but it's to say that this argument doesn't prove it. And as a result, it's nothing other than interesting. Something else that the Christian community has been involved with is something called the teleological argument, where it's basically an argument of design, where the idea is this: look, you got something that has a great deal of complexity, and it demonstrates that somehow it involves a design. Well, it must have had a designer. Well, basically the argument goes like this: all designs have to have a designer. The universe is a manifestation of great design. Therefore, the universe must have had a great designer, who would be God. And someone, there's they talk about the watch. You see the watch. Obviously, there was a watchmaker. Another common thing would be, 1,000 monkeys. Put 1,000 monkeys into a room with a bunch of typewriters and have them just bang away at the typewriters. How long would it take them to, say, come up with an exact copy or a sequel to, say, A Tale of Two Cities? Well, Charles Dickens wrote that, and he did a pretty good job. And he's an intelligent and creative person, and it kind of took a certain amount of his intelligence and creativity to actually come up with A Tale of Two Cities. So when we take a look at the universe, obviously we see that there had to have been, within this great design of the universe, some sort of a designer. Now, that's basically the way the argument goes. And I think some people find that compelling. But you know what? The argument really doesn't work all that well for a number of reasons. One of them is that there's something called chaos theory, which is a very workable concept that has to deal with. And I'm not a chaotician, by the way. I'm not really well versed in this. All that I know about it is just things that I read about. We also had Nick Albertini on the show once, who and he deals a lot with this concept of chaos. But many of the theories of chaos, and even some of the tests that have been done in a computerized environment, creating elements of chaos, have found that that chaos goes through self-organizing aspects that appear to, over time, take on complexity, but then become a house of cards and completely fall apart, reorganize, completely fall apart. That somehow the deterministic randomness, as it were, of the universe would likely result in, over a long period of time, to create a greater and greater degree of complexity. And of course, the things that are complex that can't function will cease to be what they are, and the things that can function will continue to be what they are. And this is exactly what we come up with the theory of evolution. And so there's a sense in which the theory of evolution and the concept of design seem to be at odds with each other. Now, personally, I don't really believe that they are. I do believe the universe has a designer. I do believe that evolution is a part of that design, but that's just something I believe. I don't find the claim to be compelling. I don't think I could ever sit an intelligent person down and give them a step by step by step a set of ideas and logically follow them through, so that by the end of that presentation, they would have to say, Bob, you're absolutely right. I would have to totally agree with you. There's just no other way to conclude it. There must be a God. Can't do that. That's just not going to happen. So I find the argument interesting, but I do feel that it has weaknesses. And its most critical weakness is this: it's not compelling, not to a person who recognizes and respects some of the assumptions that are built into the argument itself. So, I mean, obviously, if God created the universe, then he started it, and it may very well be true. But this is not an argument that requires anybody to believe anything. It's merely a possibility or a way of looking at it that might be thought of as reasonable. Then there's this other argument that has been brought about called the ontological argument, which, to be honest with you, I don't think it's all that good of an argument, and many other Christians would, even traditional Christians would agree with it. But this is an argument that says just the idea that we exist, just the fact that there is existence itself requires that there must be a God who brought existence into existence. And part of it even has been expressed in this way. If perfection is a concept, if we can even have a concept such as perfection, then that concept couldn't even exist in our brains unless it was somehow a possibility, and unless it was somehow something we can intelligently think of. And therefore, the very fact that there is this concept of perfection requires that there must be one who is perfect. This is one of the reasons why Anselm made his argument that, think of that being whom is greater than anything you could ever think of, and that being is God. Now, I don't know that this argument makes any sense. It strikes me as being just just very circular, very. It's kind of like a play on words. That obviously, if the sky is blue and blue is the sky, then the sky has to be blue. And I don't know. It strikes me as being kind of. I got to be honest with you. When I look at this argument and I look at it, and I'm looking for something that is compelling, I see some things that are said that seem to fit together, but I don't get it. For me, the argument fails to even be made. Now, negatively considered, some people have looked at this argument and they have even talked about it in terms of, well, wait a minute, let's imagine that there is nothing. Well, we can't do that. We can't really imagine nothing. Imagine the universe wasn't even here. Imagine you're not here. I'm not here. Nothing is here. Can you imagine that? Well, the fact that this is, and for us many times, unimaginable, then it's, how can God not exist, as it were, is the argument. So negatively considered, existence itself demands that there must be a God who exists. Of course, my reaction to that argument is, sorry, I don't even know what to say about it. Certainly, if God exists, then he does, and certainly if he doesn't, then he doesn't, and that's all there is to it. Existence is not the sort of thing that can prove or disprove that anything else that we can't get a hold of does or doesn't exist. It's, to me, the argument is really trying to say something that might be clever, or to a person who doesn't appreciate the logic of it might say, oh, hey, that makes great sense. But there's nothing in this argument that compels one, that makes them have to say the logic here is tight and solid, and I have to be a believer that the existence of God is very real. Another argument that we've given for the existence of God, and by the way, I don't want you to get lost in this. Although I'm poo-pooing these arguments for God, don't think that don't lose sight of the fact that I definitely believe in God. I'm just not believing in these arguments that try to prove his existence. There's another argument called the moral argument. Now, the basic syllogism behind this argument is this. For there to be a universal moral law, there would have to be a universal lawgiver, because it's universal. And there is a universal moral law. Therefore, there must be a universal lawgiver. And this moral law, just because of the existence of the concept of ethics and morality, they believe cannot happen, could not occur, unless there had been a God who is essentially a lawgiver. Now, first of all, I dislike this argument for several reasons. One is, are you kidding me? You're going to say our relationship with God is based upon the fact that he's the one who's making all the calls as to what's right or wrong. I don't get where the love is in that. I don't. So the idea of God as moral governor in our lives is, I'm sorry, but this seems to me the burden that can be on our back, that Jesus was saying, if you've got a burden, come to me. We'll take care of this. And well, anyway, so we have a viewer comment here. That is a vast misunderstanding of the way the word law is being used in the phrase moral law, which may be true, yes, which is being used in the same sense as the law of gravity. Right. Well, the idea being here that that the moral law is something that is part of our innate nature. And yes, yeah. And, to be honest with you, since I'm not a believer in these arguments, I don't know that I'm actually fully on top of exactly the way we should phrase them perfectly. But basically, the moral argument is the belief that the existence of morality as a thing in and of itself is somehow an argument for the universal lawgiver. But some of the problems that we have with this argument, and by the way, when I'm speaking in a way that's kind of funny and flimsy, you got to let me know. That helps. Some of the problems we have is that, do you realize that although, yes, it seems to be ubiquitous, that, all over the earth, there are people who have a sense of right and wrong. But when you get down to it, it is amazing that in every culture and throughout the history of the world, there has not been a single activity or behavior that has not been that has been considered immoral, that is not considered perfectly acceptable in other circumstances, in other cultures. This tells us that although the innate sense of having a right and wrong seems to be a human coping mechanism, we're not really on strong ground to claim that we all share the exact same morality, even at an innate level. We can't really prove that. And so This argument may be trying to argue for the existence of a morality that is more a learned adjustment to our society than it is something that is truly, in and of itself, an innate thing that is possesses its own structure. We don't know that, and we can't demonstrate that it is true, particularly when we study anthropologically a wide variety of different cultures, their habits, their religious beliefs, and their concepts of God. It just the argument begins to look a little weaker. Although it's interesting, there does seem to be at least some themes. There does seem to be at least a concept that people, particularly in the modern day, come together around the concept of love as a morality, which is in some sense a different kind of not necessarily a law in the terms of thou shalt not, but a law in terms of the nature of things. So I find this argument interesting, but I also find this uncompelling. Now, when it comes down to the bottom end of it, I find these arguments interesting, but I actually find them kind of useless. Either God exists or he does not exist. When it comes down to it, that's all there really is in terms of this question. I think that if we're going to be philosophically honest, and we could pursue this ad infinitum, and whether or not I could do this with you would have more to do with whether or not I possess the skill to take you through the process than whether or not the process itself would do this. But I would say that this process can never get us to the point where we can prove there is a God, nor can it get us to the point where we can prove there is not a God. There are interesting things to say, certain points that may feel coherent, they might feel very persuasive, but there's nothing we can lock down where all genuinely reasonable people would have to say, well, that clinches it. That makes it necessarily so. We just can't get there. So the questions are interesting, but they are actually of no value except to recognize that they exist as questions and answers that don't work, and that the issue itself remains irresolvable. Thou shalt not say thou shalt not. Okay, we'll take care of that one right away. Now, can we be comfortable? Here's an interesting question. Can we be comfortable with the reality as believers that we believe in a God that we can't prove this? We can't. We can't prove that he does or that he doesn't exist. Can we be comfortable with that? Does that feel a little flimsy? Does that feel uncertain? Does that feel like we're sticking our neck out a little too far? Well, I would wonder if we can't be comfortable with that. Maybe that explains why we're so preoccupied with feeling the need to prove God with some of these arguments. And it makes me wonder, what else do we do in our lives? How else do we behave where the real function and purpose of that behavior is, I'm trying to prove God exists, or I'm trying to prove that my belief that God exists is a thoroughly reasonable idea? Do we preoccupy ourselves with this in any manner? Got another comment here. They're finding evidence of infants as young as 6 months old demonstrating a sense of morality. Now, they're always finding a variety of things. When it comes to a child that's 6 months old, we have to interpret the sense of dissonance and what's going on, the sense of what we might perceive as guilt in that. But we don't really have any way of determining whether or not these kinds of studies are actually measuring the sorts of responses that we attribute these measurements to. But no doubt, very young, we become aware of the fact that there is ourself and others, and we begin negotiating a lot of these relational issues and problems. And no doubt, very young, as soon as this becomes a part of the negotiation, It becomes a part of the adaptation. So the fact that we might find that it comes out to be very young is very awesome and interesting, but it still doesn't prove that the morality that we're talking about exists in and of itself. It could still be a part of the social interaction that we find ourselves in, even beginning at the point of birth. And if your comment, for the sake of proving God, but interesting, not for the, I got a Huffington Post article. Babies may not be moral after all. Well, and certainly the way they cry brings the question up, doesn't it? No. Anyway, I'll have to take a look at that later. I don't have time because we're actually looking at about 5 minutes here. But I'll take a look at that later. But what I wanted to say is this, that I would want to encourage us to be comfortable with a faith in a very loving God, where we recognize that this rests on something that has no proof, doesn't require proof, can't be proven right or wrong, but it is that which we have coherently taken this leap of faith. And we do so recognizing that there's nothing to prove, nothing to be ashamed of, and there are no issues that are involved, that we realize that it either is or isn't, and we are comfortable resting in that act of faith, in seeing, in interpreting, in organizing the world that we interact with as being attributed to this. We do that by faith, not by any compelling evidence. As I understand it, that's what faith is. It's faith in the face of no compelling evidence of either sort, for or against. At best, these are only things we can observe to be consistent with the notion that God does, or if you're on the other persuasion, that he does not exist. And when it comes to having arguments with each other or trying to prove this, we're really getting caught up in the strength of our egos, trying to prove that because I have concluded that God exists, or because someone has concluded that God doesn't exist, this need to kind of prove this to others is really an attempt, I think, to establish my own adequacy. And I've come to that point in my own life where I want to believe that my adequacy is something that just simply is. Even that doesn't require any sort of proof. And if it isn't just is, then there isn't anything I can do about it anyway. Someone has commented here that I see faith as the ability to rely on evidence that you can't see with your physical eyes, but you can understand with your mind or heart. That's, I certainly don't have any problem with that way of stating it. I'm not saying that there is no evidence in terms of a probable cause. I'm not saying that there isn't a preponderance of interesting data that interacts and comes together to find that it is an extremely reasonable thing to do this. It's certainly not something we have our eyes on. And I'll tell you that I can resonate with what this viewer comment is, that the ability to rely on evidence that you can't see, but you understand with your mind or heart. The love of God, the experience of being loved by God, the uplifting experience that can be, the redeeming experience that can be, the sense of the value one can now place in themselves and in other people as a result of that experience is, I think, personally quite profound, and in some ways just inarticulate. And to me, that is a very huge part of my own personal faith. And that is, in a sense, based upon the evidence of even what I see being. Isn't it an interesting thing that we human beings can respond in a very nurtured way when we experience what we see as being loved by God, that the way that touches us, the way it helps us to develop the freedom, the lack of the giving up of the stress and many other things that we're able to rest in, the presence and abiding in God, is to me a spiritual journey that I can't imagine not being on. And so I can resonate a great deal with that comment. And of course, when we're talking about proofs of God, we're talking about the logic whereby I, as a person, can compel this upon someone else. The truth is, there's a lot of things that we can't do that with, not just the question of God's existence, but there's also another thing we can't do. We can't deny that our own authentic experience is what our own authentic experience is, even when we can't prove what that authentic experience is. And so there is a sense in which I think that our relationship with God is at that connection with the discovery of that which is authentic. Is that a proof of anything? Absolutely not. It's just a journey. But to me, that journey is very much lived in the face of God and in the presence of that loving one who has made me his own, called me his own, helps me to realize that I am his own, and that I certainly am not unique, and that we are all there. So that is basically it. So next time we get together, we'll continue talking about some of these ideas where I've had to go down a different route in terms of how I've processed a lot of this theology. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for the things you've had to say. And we'll see you Wednesday, same time. Thank you so much. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick with us in just a few minutes. At 8 o'clock, Dr. Michael W. Jones and his lovely wife, Rhonda, will be speaking with the fascinating mind of Nick Albertini. You're going to love it.